Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Peju Adebajo, previously CEO of Lumos Nigeria, Commissioner for Agriculture in Ogun State, Nigeria, and Managing Director of Lafarge Africa. As a non-executive, Peju currently sits on the boards of Wolseley UK and Ibstock plc, where she is also on the Audit, Nomination, ESG and Remuneration Committees. Over the course of her career, she has won numerous awards, including CNBC Africa Businesswoman of the Year and the Harvard Business School Nigeria Award. She was recognized on Cranfield University's 2021 100 Women to Watch list, and she was among LinkedIn's top 10 UK Green Voices in the same year. Peju, a huge welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Ollie. Good to be here.
So, Peju, I'd love to start with your experience as a CEO navigating the board. Can you tell me some examples of where you've got most value from your boards? Because people often talk about trust as being the bedrock of a high-functioning board. But what was it about those boards where you got most value out of them that they did to create that trust? And can you give me some tangible examples? If I'm sitting listening now as a board member thinking, well, I build trust in my boardroom, but I'd be interested to hear other ways that other people go about doing that. What was it that those boards you got most out of did, practically speaking, to generate that trust?
I think it's the experience of knowing that if you bring a difficult situation to the board, you're not the first target in terms of blame. So boards where there is a blame culture, where the first reaction is to find who to blame, may not be able to engender that trust. Again, a lot of it boils down to the chair, the composition of the board members in terms of having gone through those sorts of experiences themselves where perhaps there are things that they could have done better, and experience of board members, maybe sometimes in terms of deep expertise in a particular area whereby you know that if you're bringing an issue to this board and there's a particular board member, let's say with expertise in digital transformation, so you're bringing your issue to a board where there is somebody who has deep industry knowledge and actually add value. So that engenders trust because you know that you're talking to an expert. It engenders trust, for example, there isn't a blame culture on the board. It engenders trust, for example, when there are good relationships between board members. There are no conflicts of interest, for example, and they're good personal relationships. You're not going to get caught in this person's agenda versus the other person's agenda. So the board is a lot about the concrete issues and discussions which are tabled, but there's so much more in terms of soft skills, board dynamics, relationships between board members, what is said and what isn't said, and being able to mind map all of those issues, conflict, tensions, hopefully the lack thereof. If one is in a boardroom where there's less of that, there's less interpersonal conflict, there are no conflicts of interest, there is expertise board, there are people who are genuinely there to help, there are people who are not there to micromanage the CEO, for example.
Can you remember a specific moment where a chair did something that just made you feel, okay, I feel a sense of trust now? Was there an action, a particular thing they said to you where you just thought, yes, okay, this is someone I can be open with? Or was it always something that happened over a period of time through experience of working with them?
Always over a period of time. But for example, a specific situation whereby disaster happens, say, on a Friday evening or a Saturday morning. And of course, you have to report, within a certain period of time. And, folk all go across to the chair and says, XYZ has had absolute disaster. My whole team is going to be working over the weekend. We're calling the fire brigade. And I've had a chair say to me, look, it's Friday night, or look, it's a Saturday morning. Nothing concrete is going to happen. Helping me see that nothing concrete is going to happen over the weekend. Let's face it again on Monday. And sometimes just getting that breathing space is a big relief. And then you understand that the chair also recognizes you as a human being and as a leader. And that specific experience in that case, enabled me really take a weekend off and step back myself. And I was able to approach the issue much better on a Monday morning. But having that interaction, as you said, the intimacy, the credibility, the reliability, and understanding that this person has your back, they're not out to get you, they're really there to ensure that you're able to perform at your best. I think those experiences, sometimes illustrated by the example I gave, but consistently over a period of time, enables one build trust between board members or between the CEO and the chair. But that relationship, I think, is so important because it sends signals, in fact, to the rest of the organization about the unity between the board and the chair, therefore creates a conducive environment for implementation of strategy and indeed taking difficult decisions, knowing that the board is behind you gives a CEO much more confidence to take difficult decisions.
Yeah, I like that. And I suppose what that also does is signals as a chair, if you're saying take that time, it's signaling that you care about the CEO's well-being as well. And I think chairs that take time to think about the CEO's well-being and spend time thinking about, are you getting enough sleep? Are you doing enough exercise? Are you spending enough time, on your social side, on your family side, on your sort of fitness? I think also is a very powerful way of elevating that relationship. Have you had chairs who've been good on those fronts?
I have had chairs who've been good on those fronts, and I need to remember myself to be good on those fronts because, we talk about health, safety, and thank God well-being has crept into that equation as well. It's very important that as leaders, we demonstrate that well-being is important and we are seen to be taking care of ourselves. So it's good when the chair does it. It's good when the chair signals that he or she expects the CEO and the leadership team to do it. And that way, we send a message to the rest of the organization that yes, it's important to get the work done. Yes, it's important to meet targets, but not at the expense, for example, of other things which matter to us and could be even more important in the long term.
Exactly. It's that sort of high performance culture. Looking at the other side of the coin, are there examples you can share without breaking any confidences of when boards have been most unhelpful for you?
It goes back to what I would call a board which isn't performing well. So, for example, board members who maybe have too many commitments and therefore are not able to give time to the company, who haven't read their papers and therefore are going to ask questions which are irrelevant or have already been addressed in the board papers. It goes back to that whole issue of board effectiveness, board dynamics. What is each member of the board there to do? And are they able to discharge their duties properly? So where board members are themselves ineffective or perhaps don't have enough understanding of a situation, or perhaps have vested interests which are not revealed. And in some cases, I would say as well, it's good to have balance on the board. And so when you have performance pressure, it's good to have balance of the short term and the long term. So boards where there's perhaps an undue emphasis on short-term measures and short-term performance, those sorts of situations can then end up being very stressful for a CEO. So whatever mechanisms are in place to ensure that the board is able to balance the short term and the long term, it could be shareholders, it could be investors. That's why when we talk about stakeholder management and looking at stakeholder interests, it's actually important and relevant because I think it then more easily and naturally brings long-term issues back into the boardroom. So where there are short-term pressures, then you could end up with being unduly under stress and perhaps it dancing to the tune of the markets when really we should be looking at things in a more balanced way.
There's something you said there around board member preparedness that really resonated with me. I think that there's nothing more frustrating as a CEO when you've got board members where you're having to retread old ground because they haven't taken notes the last time you had the conversation and they haven't taken the time before the meeting to refresh their memory about those notes. And in my experience, some of the best board members are the ones who can just pick up the discussion as if they were an executive in the team because I don't know how they do it, the really good ones. But that, in my experience, there are far too many where you spend unnecessary time going back over ground that's already been covered because it was 2 months since you last met and probably 6 since you last discussed the topic. Is that something you've experienced regularly?
Or not regularly, but I think, again, the best boards are where you have board members who are actually engaged with the organization. So yes, you had the meeting 6 weeks ago or 3 months ago, but at least you're keeping up to date with new snippets of news about the organization. Perhaps you have a call with a CEO or a member of the management team in between. So you're not completely divorced from what's going on. Sometimes also you have board members who have particular angles and perhaps they represent a particular interest. And you know that that's the song that they're going to sing. But again, I keep on going back to the chair. A good chair would be able to smooth over the situation and ensure that the conversation keeps on track. So the chair and the CEO really go in tandem.
So if we dig down into, I'd love to explore a couple of different areas in a bit more detail around where boards have added value. So obviously one of the big ones is the whole strategy question. What's been your experience as a CEO of the value that boards have added to you on strategy? And I'd love to, if you can, get a few sort of tangible examples that bring it to life, because strategy always feels like such a nebulous term for me.
So as you said, strategy is a nebulous term, but essentially it's about the vision of what a company needs to do to ensure that value is derived for shareholders and stakeholders. What do we need to do in the short term and the long term? I find that boards that are able to take time, for example, to have those offsite discussions on strategy, it's very useful, I think, to be able to devote enough time to really dig into a strategic plan, to understand all the nuances about the industry, the competition, the suppliers, trends, etc. So boards who are able to devote time to deeply understand the industry, deeply understand the organization, its strengths and weaknesses, will add value in terms of that strategy formulation. As with most things, strategy is holistic. It's not just about setting a direction. It's about ensuring that all of the levers are in place to ensure that implementation is carried out as expected. So, for example, having set the strategy, what are the performance metrics to be chosen to ensure that the strategy is on track? There's an art and science of setting performance targets, and I really actually enjoy this. I think setting the right targets is so important, because if you set the wrong targets, then of course you're going in the wrong direction. But setting the right targets, the when, the how, the why, and ensuring that there's a frequency of monitoring performance along those targets, and that the board gets information on a regular basis about how we're performing against the strategy. Those are the levers that the board has to ensure that when strategy is set, first of all, deeply understanding the context, and then ensuring that when it is actually set, there are enough milestones to let us know whether or not we're on track.
Can you give me an example of when a board has changed your thinking around strategy for the better and how it did that?
Every time we arrive at strategy by consensus, and it's a discussion whereby, as long as one is open, there's always somebody with a better idea, with a different angle. No concrete example come to mind at the moment, but there is always somebody with a better. So, for example, on the acquisition, you're hell bent on acquiring a company maybe in another country, and after having the discussion, one realizes that you're not ready to deal with complexities of doing business in a different environment, because you don't have the apparatus or the structure within the organization, and you may be better off, for example, you focusing on the home market, or vice versa. But there's never a time when one would have a discussion with the board of directors where there would not be value added, assuming that the board members are of the right composition and have the right experience behind them.
Okay. Maybe let's explore another topic around talent, which is often, would be on most boards' agendas. Can you tell me about a time when a board has helped you in the discussion as a CEO around talent and making better talent choices?
Well, so structure follows strategy. So talent starts with understanding the organizational structure, which is relevant to deliver the strategy that one has decided on. In my history, for example, there was a time when I didn't have a chief operations officer, and it became very evident after some time that there was a need for the organization structure to change, and I needed to bring a COO on board. The conversation today might be about having a chief sustainability officer. Do you have one? Don't you have one? And why? So again, the beauty is in the discussion. The beauty is in understanding. And there's never a right answer. Hopefully the one that you decide on is the right answer. But, the beauty in the discussion in terms of understanding the whys and why or why not, and then together arriving at what we think is best for the organization. But I've certainly had situations whereby I had a blind spot and I didn't realize that there was a certain role which wasn't being done well. Or perhaps there's a weakness in the CFO, which I may not have spotted, but because I have other CFOs on the board, they're very easily able to say to me, there's a weakness here. Can we consider? And in this case, it was about getting a mentor for the CEO. So for the CFO, getting another experienced CFO to mentor the CFO. And that made a big difference in terms of the CFO's performance. So there are lots of areas where the board adds value when it comes to talent. The other is succession planning. Many CEOs would need to have that discussion, not just planning for their top team, but also what's the succession plan for the CEO. So people are really what makes the strategy happen at the end of the day. And just having the right team is extremely important. And of course, the board also plays a role in motivating the team to the extent that we can have informal sessions of the top team or the level below that with the board. It's a fantastic way of making sure that those people actually get exposed to board members, have a sense of what is happening beyond the immediate organization. And board members also get a sense of the talents that lies throughout the organization. So I love it when we can have new joiners, apprentices, and people who are born on Mondays, whatever it is. Any excuse to expose talent to the board, I think is very useful for both the board and for the people who are able to meet board members.
I want to talk a bit about the S part as well, because you've talked in the past about your admiration for women who've broken through bias. I'm interested to know what's been your experience of bias and what insights can you offer to boards who are thinking about becoming more inclusive at both the board and organization level?
Well, it's interesting. The time when I remember I did my engineering degree many, many moons ago. And at the time, engineering was a very male-dominated field, but I didn't even really appreciate it then. And I'm glad to see that same university now has much better gender diversity ratios. But I would say that was a time when I think certainly there weren't enough attempts made to ensure that we had a diverse intake. And I think organizations, academic institutions are doing much better now in terms of setting proper diversity targets. But I think it's not for any organization. We're doing well. Where are we in terms of that? Well, first, is it important to us? With gender diversity, I certainly hope that there's no organization that would not say that gender diversity is important. But beyond that, there's so many different aspects of diversity. So which is most important to the organization? Need to understand that there's so many possible areas of diversity, which is actually most important to the organization. And then it's the usual thing that one would expect to be done. Where are we and where do we want to be? And how do we ensure, again, that we set targets? It's great if those targets are published because then that gives some measure of accountability. And it's also great if those targets are incentivized. So, somebody's bonus will rise or fall depending on how and when we meet those targets. But in terms of recruiting more people with diversity into the organization, it's important. And I think this is almost par for the course now in terms of recruiting organizations that represent those diverse populations. And also important to have the interview panels, the CVs, which basically are blind resumes, and have structured interviews whereby one can at least try to remove some of the systematic bias in interviewing. But you may certainly have to go the extra mile to get diverse candidates. And remember, at least when it comes to certain types of candidates, many organizations are after the same pool of candidates. So the good ones would go first. So I think it's important for organizations to set targets, to publish those targets, to incentivize the achievement of those targets. And I think it's also important that leaders ask themselves why, because I think the leader needs to ask themselves, why is it important to me to have women on the board? Why is it important to me to have ethnic representation on the board? And I think it can genuinely answer those questions. It becomes easier for them to ensure that those policies are implemented throughout the organization. If you're just following the bandwagon, then it won't last.
And what about at the board level specifically? I mean, I know from my own experience, when I've been the only independent board member, it can sometimes be quite difficult difficult being a lone voice. And when you have other, other independents onto the board, suddenly actually it just gives you a bit more time to think, and it allows you to, sometimes if you're challenging on something, when you've got multiple voices there, it dilutes the nature of the challenge and gives it more of a collaborative feel. What's your experience of that, and what has it been? Are there times when you felt uncomfortable on boards as a board member?
Certainly at the beginning of my board journey, I can tell you I felt not very uncomfortable on the board. It took me a while to settle down. But as regards independent directors, again, as a publicly listed company, you do have to have a certain number, a certain representation of independent directors. Perhaps private companies may not have those stipulations. But I think it is good practice to have more than one independent director on the board. And I think between public and private companies, certainly the large private companies would begin to veer in terms of practice towards the public and listed organizations. The more independent directors you have on the board, the more, as you said, you're able to get the diversity of opinions, which I think really improve decision making. So yes, I would agree with that. In terms of being uncomfortable on the board, I say to myself, yes, I may be a woman of color board, but I'm not here to represent every single person of color. That's not possible. And yes, I may be a woman on the board, but I'm certainly not here to represent all women on the board. However, as a woman of color, but I do have a certain responsibilities, not necessarily to the board in that sense, but to everyone who might look like me, who looks up to me and says, and usually they pray that I succeed on the board. But I think it's my duty to ensure that I do succeed, to make it easier for the next person and the next person and the next person coming up. So it's more of a responsibility that I feel towards everyone else who looks like me and who might aspire to be in this position one day, to let them know that it is possible and that, yes, you can do this and you will be successful at it. And hopefully you'll be much more successful than I have been. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but in terms of being alone on the board, I mean, certainly as a woman of color, often I am alone as a woman of color. Well, my responsibility is more to the broader community. That on the board, I'm there to give my views as somebody with experience and somebody who has something to contribute on the board.
Really interesting. Are there things that chairs or other board members have done either well or badly that have either helped or hindered your feeling at sort of home and included on a board?
I suppose I have taken the responsibility on myself to make sure that I'm at home on the board. And this goes to the much broader issue of how do you integrate yourself onto a board? So it starts before you join the board in terms of ensuring you understand your role on the board. It may be that you're a finance person and your role is, perhaps you're also going to end up being the chair of the audit committee, or you may end up being the person who's going to be in charge of REM, or you may end up being the person who's in charge of ESG. Whatever it is, I think it's good to understand what your role is on the board and this happens even before you join the board. In my case, I had discussions with my chairs to just understand what the expectations were of me. And that gave me some more comfort and confidence going on to the board. Naturally, one is prepared for the board meeting. That goes without saying in terms of reading the board papers, and one would have had a good induction, which would end up involved meeting some of the external stakeholders, the auditors, the lawyers, the brokers, and the internal stakeholders, the leadership team, and as many of the senior management team as possible. In terms of making myself feel comfortable on the board, I think it's very important to build social connections with other board members. And that means that, one attends the dinners, one does the science together. And I always arrive early before board meetings because there's the banter that goes on before the board meeting. Also, you don't rush off after board meetings to ensure that those social connections are there. And having those social connections, I think, makes it then easier to feel comfortable to contribute on the board because you've developed a bit of a rapport with the other board members and you know what their perspectives are. It's also useful, I think, sometimes before you join the board, and I did this as well, to have someone give an honest conversation about what the culture of the board is like Are there particular red lines not to cross? Are there some, hobby horses to avoid? A little bit of emotional intelligence, I think, is very important, and certainly was important for me to be able to feel comfortable on the board and actually get used to practicing making contributions and hearing my own voice. So I won't say that it's something that happened immediately. I was certainly quieter the first few board meetings, listening and watching, observing board dynamics, and just making sure that I was also able to read the room. And that really helps, knowing when to make a contribution. I certainly don't expect to speak all the time, but knowing when to make the contribution, I think, is extremely important.
Got it. So if there's someone listening now who sits on a board and they've got a new board member joining, what would be your best tip to them? Imagine it was you that they had joining. What would be the sort of the one or two things that they could do to make you feel that you belonged as part of that team as quickly as possible and sort of ramped up to, your highest performance potential?
I think both inside and outside of the boardroom, board members can certainly welcome the new board member and encourage them to participate. So the outside the boardroom, making them feel comfortable, whatever social exchanges happen outside of the boardroom, it could be just, asking questions about your home and family, whatever it is that, or finding areas of common interest, I think is always useful in terms of breaking the ice. And then, of course, in the boardroom, it's important, and the chair would usually do this. If someone hasn't contributed for an entire meeting, you could find ways of asking them what they think so that you hear all voices. There's no point in bringing diversity into the board or bringing new people into the boardroom if we don't then have the benefit of hearing their experience. And there's a reason why they're on the board. And so I think the more encourage those people to speak up and ensure that their views are heard and reflected, that will go a long way, I think, to helping new board members settle in.
So for someone listening now who's about to step into their first board role and wanting to sort of benefit from the lessons of your experience, what would be your advice to them for making sure they ramp up as quickly as possible and shortcut some of those feelings of nervousness and reticence?
I think the best remedy to be less nervous is to be as well informed as possible. And that could be as broad as one likes it, as well informed on the industry, as well informed on the company, as well informed on all the unwritten rules as possible. So whatever one needs to do to be well informed, I think would make towards settling in as quickly as possible. And obviously for a first-time board member, it may take longer than somebody who's already been on boards. And obviously for them, the process will be much shorter. But also, I think it's also to remember that it's a two-way street. You are there to contribute something. There is something that you know that other people don't know. And from my perspective as well, there's, apart from contributing to the organization, there's also a purpose for me wanting to be on boards. And staying true to that purpose helps me remember that apart from my contributions, there's something that I also want to see those organizations doing, which aligns with my purpose for being on the board.
Really interesting. That resonates with, it's a sort of common topic that comes in our mastermind groups for board members too. We host these sessions where they can exchange experiences with each other. And it's one of the most common ones that comes up amongst new board members where they're wrestling with this challenge of why is no one else talking about this thing, which is really obvious. And what they realize typically through those discussions is that it's really obvious because they're an expert in that area. And that's why they were brought into the boardroom. And the others haven't seen it because they're not experts in that area. But there's this bystander effect where they assume because no one else has brought it up, it must be not worth bringing up, and overcoming that hurdle is a recurring challenge. Peju, the time has flown by. It's time to move on to our 5-question quickfire, where I say a statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Okay, go ahead.
So first up is best book every board member should read and why?
Non-Executive Director's Handbook, and I'm on the 6th edition, I have to say. I bought the 5th edition. It didn't have ESG in it. And so the 6th edition has just come out. I've just purchased it. I can't believe I have edition 5 and 6, but it's that useful. everything that you need to know to be a board.
Fantastic. Your favorite quote?
It's in the battle between the rock and the stream. The stream wins every time because of perseverance. And what does this mean? That, the stream, by virtue of being a stream, gradually wears away the rock. And that really resonates.
I love that one. Your best ever holiday and why?
My 50th birthday in Morocco. Big time there with all my children and husband. And it was lovely.
That's fantastic. Your most significant professional insight?
I would say, do unto others as you would have them do to you. I just believe in fairness and respect.
And last but not least, your favorite podcast?
It has to be Blinkist, and that's because I cheat. I don't necessarily have time to read all the books that I need to read, so I do a Blinkist. I also like the FT podcast. I listen to it every morning, 5-6 minutes, and I get my news in that time. Then I read the FT if I have time.
Fantastic. I used to use the Blinkist, although now I use ChatGPT to summarize things for me, which I find really helpful.
Can I have 3?
Peju, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been an absolute privilege. I have really enjoyed having the benefits of your insights, both as a CEO and a board member. So thank you so much for taking the time to share them with us.
Great. Thank you, Oli. This was fun.
And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@nurole.com. That's podcast@nurole.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.